It wasn't a dream. It is, in fact, reality. The Orioles went out and got the true ace, got the true number one starting pitcher to add to their rotation as they traded for Corbin Burnes late last week. So now the question is, with Burnes at the top, where does the Orioles rotation stack up in the AL East, in the American League, and across baseball, especially if they get to the postseason? We'll answer that question coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
There, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, February 5th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Orioles rotation at this point. It's early February, but the O's, of course, made the exciting new addition last week, acquiring Corbin Burnes to be their ace in a trade with the Milwaukee Brewers. So we'll take a look at the new state of the Orioles rotation, and not just how good it could be, but where it stacks up, because many thought going into this year that would be the weakness of this Orioles team. It has now become a strength with Corbin Burnes, but how much of a strength compared to the other best teams in baseball? That's what we'll get to coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. So Corbin Burnes, I still can't kind of believe it as I record this episode, but he's going to be in an Oriole uniform in 2024. He's going to be headlining the rotation. This is the same Corbin Burnes that is, without argument, one of the 10 best starting pitchers right now in all of Major League Baseball. And yes, we can have the qualms about, was it a good trade? Will the Orioles be able to re-sign him, or will he just be here for 1 year? He is a free agent after 2024. But this is really the best part about this move, is that the Orioles made this move for now. They did not make this move for the future. They made it for now. And yes, of course, the two trades they made at the deadline last year, acquiring Jack Flaherty and Shintaro Fujinami, those were now moves, but 90% of moves any team makes at the deadline when they are acquiring big league talent is a now move. Other than that, this is really the first offseason move that the Orioles have made that is truly a now roster move from Mike Elias. This is we are trying to win in 2024. And Mike Elias said as much when he spoke to the media on Friday. So it's really time to focus on the 2024 season for the Orioles, because if they're going and trading away two of their top 10 prospects and picking up a guy who most likely, we shouldn't say most likely, but there's a good chance becomes a free agent after this year and they won't be able to bring back, this is them going to try and win a World Series in 2024. So how good is this rotation for this season with Corbin Burnes at the top? Well, the first thing that shows you how good Corbin Burnes is, FanGraphs does its projections for starting pitcher WAR for every team's starting rotation, plus, the depth they have behind it, because no team will ever, again, make it through a season where they're only using 5 starters. You got to have the depth too. The Orioles were projected to be 24th in starting pitcher WAR via FanGraphs before this Corbin Burnes trade. They jumped up to 12th after the trade. That is how good Corbin Burnes is. And so let's look at that rotation with Corbin Burnes at the top. FanGraphs projecting him to throw 196 innings with a 3.52 ERA, which I think is probably a little high, but they still project him for the 4th highest starting pitcher WAR in all of baseball in 2024, because he's giving you about 200 really, really good innings. And there's not many pitchers that do that at this point in Major League Baseball. The thing is, for Burnes, if you're looking at starting pitcher WAR over at FanGraphs, he's got the second most since the start of the 2020 season. And yeah, 3.39 ERA last year, 194 innings, like pretty good stats. A little bit of a tick down from 2021 Cy Young Corbin Burnes and even very, very good 2022 Corbin Burnes. But if you even just look in the second half of last year, he had a 2.71 ERA with the strikeouts up and the walks down after the All-Star break. So he was getting better after a little bit of a shaky start to last season. Burnes is going to be great. Just great atop this rotation. Then you got Kyle Bradish in the number 2 slot, finishing 4th in AL Cy Young voting last year, looked to be the lead of this rotation if the Orioles weren't going to get a true number 1 guy. Threw about 170 innings, had a 2.83 ERA. He was spectacular last year. Now, FanGraphs projections a little low on Bradish as well. 171 innings, which would be more than last year, but projecting him for a 3.79 ERA. Listen, I don't think Kyle Bradish is going to have another 2.83 ERA season, but Bradish is too good for his ERA to jump by a run. I see him more in the 3.3, 3.4 spot. It's not going to just digress that much next year. Then in the number 3 spot, you've got Grayson Rodriguez. FanGraphs, again, with a projection that I think he's just going to be better than it. It's 155 innings and a 3.82 ERA. I think he might throw more innings than that, and I think he'll be better. I mean, he threw 122 innings at the big league level last year with a 4.35 ERA, but we know it was a tale of two halves for Grayson Rodriguez. Terrible, not terrible. He was up and down in the first half. Went down to the minors, came back, had a 2.58 ERA in the second half of the season, was tremendous for the Orioles. He's going to be better than those projections. I mean, I think all 3 of their top guys are going to beat the projections. Then you've got John Means with a projection that I agree a little bit more with. FanGraphs projecting him to throw 121 innings and give the Orioles a 4.31 ERA. He could certainly be in the high 3s. I could see that happening. And he could certainly throw more than 120 innings. But I wouldn't expect 190, 200 innings from John Means next year. He's still, I would consider, in the process of coming off Tommy John surgery. I mean, when he returned in September last year, he only made 4 starts and then was shut down again with elbow discomfort and couldn't pitch in the postseason. And I know, he is fully healthy, feels good, said he feels good, and is ready to go for spring training and should have himself one of these 5 rotation spots. But you can't put a lot of eggs in the John Means basket. And that's why it's so great they went and got Burnes. It knocks Means to either 4 or 5 in your rotation. And if he's only going to give you 120, 130 innings coming off Tommy John, you feel a lot better about that when he's in one of those final 2 spots. And one of the other 2 spots does, of course, go to Dean Kramer, who's kind of going to be the other side of John Means, which is he's going to throw a lot of innings. I mean, he's projected for 171. He threw 173 last year. I see no reason why Dean Kramer can't reach 180 innings. And the projection is a 4.17 ERA. I mean, he was 4.12 last year. If you can get 180 innings at 4.17 from Dean Kramer, your number 5 starter, you are in really, really good shape. And that's how important Kramer is to this team. And then there's the depth that'll be on the opening day roster. Cole Irvin and Tyler Wells will be your 2 starting pitching depth options. Both of them will certainly have a chance to try and win a rotation spot in spring training. I just think Kramer and Means have the inside edge there. But Irvin and Wells both showed last year that they can pitch well out of the bullpen. And I think they'll be able to do that, but they'll also make some starts. Again, you're not getting through a season with just 5 starters. Those guys will step in and make starts for the Orioles as well. And then if they have to go beyond that, which if you're the Orioles right now, in a perfect scenario, you only have, I think, 7 players make a start for you next year. Those 7 I just mentioned, the 5 in the projected rotation, plus Cole Irvin and Tyler Wells. If those are the only 7 guys that start games for the Orioles next year on the mound, that's pretty good. But you know that doesn't always happen. And sometimes injuries happen. You have to fall deeper. Even if it's just a couple of spot starts, you generally have to dig deeper into the depth chart. And that is where guys like maybe Bruce Zimmerman come up into this conversation. A guy like Jonathan Heasley, who the Orioles picked up in trade with the Royals earlier this offseason, and the young guys, the prospects like a Cade Povich or a Chase McDermott could fit in and potentially make a start for the Orioles as well. But in total, you look what the starting pitching did last year. And again, the Orioles finished 16th in starting pitcher WAR last season. They were essentially a middle-of-the-pack starting rotation. Much better in the second half, but overall, a middle-of-the-pack starting rotation. They threw 878 innings, had a 4.14 ERA, about 8.5 strikeouts, and 2.5 walks per 9. Just really solid numbers. And again, it shows you at 16th. But here's kind of the difference here. The projections for the Orioles from FanGraphs, even though I feel like for Burnes, Bradish, and Rodriguez, the projections are low. I think they're going to outperform those projections. The Orioles are projected to get 903 innings out of their starters. That's basically another 25 innings from starting pitchers. That's huge. Doesn't tax your bullpen as much, especially when you won't have Felix Bautista. They're projected to lower the starter ERA to 3.93 on the season, up the strikeouts, and keep the walks about the same. And again, that puts their projection at 12th for starting pitcher WAR. And that would be huge for the Orioles, not just because a better starting rotation will lead to more regular season wins, and hopefully for the Orioles, because you can't have less postseason wins than last year, more wins in the postseason as well. But also the big thing is here, and we know this as Orioles fans, even when the Orioles have had success really in this century, it hasn't been because of the rotation. I mean, quite frankly, even in the 90s, I mean, they had some solid rotations, but those were teams led by their offenses as well. It's kind of been the Oriole way really since they won the 3 World Series. I mean, those teams, although they had great lineups, were led most of the time by fantastic starting pitching. But the new era, under the Angelos era, the Camden Yards era Orioles, those have been offensive-oriented teams. And sometimes it's because, well, the ballpark until the last 2 years has been a very hitter-friendly ballpark, and that's certainly added to this. But the Orioles have not had their starting pitchers finish in even the top half, the top 15 in Major League Baseball in starting pitcher WAR, according to Fangraphs, since 2000. You have to go back to 2000 when they finished 8th. But the only reason they finished 8th is because their starters pitched a lot of innings that year, and some of them were good. A lot of them were not. They were still 23rd in starter ERA, so I'm not even going to count that one. The last time the Orioles had a starting rotation that was in the top half of Major League Baseball, you got to go 1 year back further. It was 1999. In this century, they have not had really a top half of baseball starting rotation. I'm not talking about even a top 5 or a top 10, just in the top half of baseball. That is what they're projected to do this year, is finish 12th. That is a huge step forward for the Orioles, knowing they already have, even without Felix, good bullpen and a great young lineup. You got to go back to 1999 when they were 12th in starting pitcher WAR and 11th in starting pitcher ERA. Now, that was a losing team in 1999, but it was Mike Mussina, Scott Erickson, Sidney Ponson, Juan Guzman, and Jason Johnson. That was the 5-man rotation for the Orioles, with a few more guys scattered in with some starts here and there. Mike Mussina is great. Sidney Ponson was all right that year. Scott Erickson was solid that year. This rotation they're sending out in 2024 is better than that. Corbin Burnes is the best Orioles pitcher since Mike Mussina, and I'm taking Bradish and Rodriguez over Erickson and Ponson. This is a team that maybe won't be known for its starting pitching because the offense is so good, but the starting pitching can carry it at times. And it's carried it at times in the past, but you can count on this rotation to carry you when you really need it. That is going to be the best part here. So now the question becomes, okay, we know this Orioles rotation compared to rotations of old is going to be better than we've seen in a long time. But that's not really what matters when you're trying to win a World Series in 2024. What matters is, how does your rotation compare to those around the league? So coming up next, we'll start in their own division. One of the toughest in baseball, the AL East. The Orioles won it last year with 101 wins. Can they win it again? How does the rotation stack up in the division? We'll talk about that coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl week is here, and it's a happy Super Bowl week to all who celebrate from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're like me, Super Bowl Sunday is all about scoring the best seat on the couch, grabbing your favorite football snacks, and placing some super bets. And if I'm going to place a bet, I'm just placing it on the 49ers money line because I do not want to see the Chiefs win another Super Bowl. And FanDuel has so many ways for you to end the season with a W or 2 or even 3. Not only can you bet on who will win Super Bowl 58, but FanDuel also has bets for which players will score a touchdown, how many points will be scored, and so much more. And new customers join today, and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to sign up. That is FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So the Orioles did it. They got Corbin Burnes. They got a top-of-the-rotation starter, a true ace in Major League Baseball. But he may only be here for 2024 before he hits free agency. And he continues to say, and he said it on Friday, that he wants to hit free agency and see what he can get. Now, that doesn't mean the Orioles can't bring him back, but it's less likely that the Orioles are able to extend him before he actually does hit free agency next winter. This may be your only year with Corbin Burnes. And the rotation's already gotten much better from it, but how does it compare to the AL East? Now, if we look at these same FanGraphs projections that had the Orioles at 12th in starting pitcher WAR in 2024 after the Corbin Burnes trade, they put the Orioles 3rd out of 5 in the AL East, which I think is fair, but maybe not correct. In the basement, they had the Boston Red Sox. Now, they had them 17th in baseball, which I think is a little high, but they had the Red Sox the worst in the AL East. Their rotation projects out to be Lucas Giolito, who was a free agent and is coming off a couple of bad years. We'll see if he rebounds. Brian Bayo, who was a really intriguing rookie last year. Nick Pivetta, who's kind of refound it in the Red Sox rotation. Cutter Crawford, who seems to be a solid back-end guy. And then Tanner Houck. I see him as a reliever in the future, but projecting to be their number 5 guy. And then they don't have a lot of depth behind that. It is mostly prospects and then relievers who could be stretched out as the Red Sox depth behind it. They really don't have a top-end starter at all if Giolito's your number 1 guy, and they've got no depth at all. Orioles are clearly better than what the Red Sox are throwing out there. They've got the Rays at 16th, ranking 4th in the AL East. Projecting to be Zach Eflin at the top, who had a really good year, his first year with the Rays last year. Aaron Savali, who the Rays traded for at the deadline last season from Cleveland, wasn't as good with Tampa down the stretch. Then Zach Littell, who the Rays just plucked off waivers. He had been a reliever and turned him into like a solid 5 to 6 inning starter, because of course they did. Then there's Ryan Pepio, the young right-hander who the Rays acquired in the Tyler Glasnow trade with the Dodgers this offseason, and the young flamethrower in Taj Bradley, who we saw from time to time last year, but is kind of figuring things out. The depth for the Rays, they have a few guys here and there in the minors, and then they also have a lot of guys who were injured last year severely, but are going to be returning at some point this year. They should get at least a half a season, if not more, out of Shane Baz returning from injury. And then they had Drew Rasmussen and Jeffrey Springs have great starts to the year, both get Tommy John. They could both be due back at some point later in the second half of the season, but it's really tough to say. There's a chance that Rasmussen and Springs, neither of them pitch in 2024, and they get a limited Baz. And if you're just looking at what they have now, again, the Rays just don't have an ace. They're way too injured, and that's just right now. The Orioles are just better across the board and much, much healthier than Tampa Bay as well. Then they have the O's at 12th, and then the projections have the Blue Jays at 8th in baseball and 2nd in the AL East. Of course, the former Oriole in Kevin Gausman at the top, he has turned himself into a true ace in Major League Baseball. There's a veteran, Chris Bassett, that'll be going into his 2nd year with Toronto, had a really, really solid campaign last year. Jose Barrios, he was an ace with Minnesota. He was bad with the Blue Jays in 2022, turned it back around and had a good season last year. He's a really solid number 3. Then there's the lefty Yusei Kikuchi, who had an up and down season, but you still trust him. And at number 5 is maybe the biggest question mark of any team's starting rotation in the AL East, and that is Alek Manoah, is still projected as the number 5 starter for the Blue Jays. Remember, he had been great for a couple of years. Things just fell apart last year. He got optioned all the way down to rookie ball and never returned to the Blue Jays roster in the second half. The depth behind him is their top pitching prospect, and really their top prospect right now, in Ricky Tiedemann, who most people think is going to get to the big leagues in some point in 2024. And then there's Yariel Rodriguez, a pitcher who the Blue Jays gave a 4-year deal to out of Cuba. Now, most people think he will end up as a reliever, but he's going to at least try to be a starter and could at least be starting depth for Toronto. If Alek Manoah can be anything close to what he used to be, the Blue Jays, I think, definitely have a better rotation than the O's. But if Manoah is still a question mark and it has to be Rodriguez or Tiedemann or like another veteran signed off the street as their number 5 guy, I think that brings Toronto much closer to what the Orioles have. I think Gausman and Burnes fairly equal right there in terms of their production right now. But the Blue Jays' next 3 pitchers in Barrios, Bassett, and Kikuchi, just a little more proven at this point with what they can do than Bradish, Rodriguez, and Means. So I'd give a slight edge to Toronto. And then FanGraphs projections have the Yankees as the best rotation in the AL East. They have them 6th in baseball. Of course, Garrett Cole won the AL Cy Young. He's the best pitcher in the American League right now. No question about it, as their number 1. But then it's just a lot of question marks after that for the Yankees. Marcus Stroman they brought in. He's projected as their number 2. He hasn't thrown more than 130 innings the last 2 years. A lot of injury concerns. Carlos Rodon projected as their number 3. They brought him in last year. I mean, he couldn't stay on the field at all. He's really good when he's on the mound, but he barely pitched last season, and a lot of those injury issues are concerning. Then there's Clark Schmidt, who's just like a solid back-end guy. And then there's Nestor Cortez, who was great 2 years ago, and he just keeps getting injured. He's supposed to be healthy enough to pitch at some point this year, but you just don't know what Cortez will be after all these injuries. And then the Yankees, they traded away a good amount of their pitching prospects to go and get Juan Soto in that deal. So there's not a lot of depth behind them. They re-signed Luke Weaver. They've got the young guy in Luis Heel and a couple of more prospects as well. Not a lot of depth. Now for the Yankees, clearly, still, Garrett Cole is better than Corbin Burnes. They've got a better number 1. But with the injury issues to Cortez and Rodon and Stroman and the depth being a question, I'd actually take the Orioles over the Yankees. So the way I would rank the starting rotations in the AL East, I'd still have Toronto number 1, even if Alek Manoah doesn't give them much. I give Toronto a slight edge. And if Manoah gets back close to anything like what he used to be, it's definitely Toronto. Then I'm taking the Orioles, now with Corbin Burnes at the top of that rotation. Then I'd go Yankees just because of Garrett Cole, then slightly below them, the Rays, and then a lot of space. And then I'd put the Red Sox as by far the worst rotation in the AL East. But again, there are some things that, if the Yankees are healthy, if Cortez is healthy and good, if Rodon's healthy and good, and Stroman's healthy and good, well, then, yeah, there's certainly an argument for them to be better than the Orioles. If the Rays get healthy sooner than later and Rasmussen and Springs come back, they could be better than the O's. But as it stands right now, I'm still taking Toronto over the Orioles. But after that, O's having the number 2 rotation in the AL East, yeah, that feels pretty good. And that's all great, right? That is huge for your chances to win the division. But here's kind of the big thing here. The Orioles had a good enough rotation last year without Corbin Burnes to win the rotation or win the AL East. It was basically this rotation instead of, Kyle Gibson was in there and Corbin Burnes was not. And then you mostly didn't have John Means. You had a combination of Tyler Wells and Cole Irvin, essentially, in those spots. The rotation's better now. And the one last year helped them win the AL East. What the rotation last year didn't do is help them win a playoff series or help them win a World Series. And we all saw it. The biggest reason I would say why the Orioles were swept by the Rangers in the ALDS was the rotation just faltered. Yeah, Kyle Bradish was solid, but Grayson Rodriguez and Dean Kramer got lit up in games 2 and 3, and they didn't have enough to win a playoff series. Corbin Burnes is going to help fix that. But the true test is, if you're just looking at playoff rotations, right, the top 3 guys you've got out there, how do the Orioles compare there with their top 3? Talk about that to finish off the pod coming up next. So, of course, Corbin Burnes makes the Orioles' regular season rotation much, much better. But again, it was good enough last year. They won the AL East and won 101 games with the rotation they had last year. They had the Bradish, Rodriguez, Kyle Gibson, Dean Kramer, and then Tyler Wells in the first half, and then Cole Irvin / John Means essentially in the second half. And that was enough for the Orioles. I guess Jack Flaherty was in there for a bit as well in the second half. That was enough for the O's to win the division. Wasn't enough to win in the playoffs. Even though I thought Kyle Bradish looked solid in his game 1 start in the ALDS, he only went 4 2/3 innings, and he gave up a good amount of hits. Grayson Rodriguez was horrendous, and then Dean Kramer was maybe even worse in games 2 and 3. They lost John Means because he had more elbow soreness. I was calling for the fact that the O's should have started Kyle Gibson in game 3 instead of Dean Kramer. I think it would have been better, but I think the O's probably still lose that game. That is why the O's needed this number 1. Yes, you can be better and deeper in the regular season, but you got a guy, a dude, a capital D dude in game 1 of a playoff series. And that is what Corbin Burnes gives them. And pretty much every year he's been with the Brewers, they've been in the postseason. So he knows how to pitch in the playoffs as well. But how do they compare to the rest of the league in terms of postseason rotations? Now I understand that generally throughout a postseason, you do need 4 starters, right? You need 4. But for this exercise, I went with top 3. And that's because how much different is your top 4 really than your top 5? I already talked about how the O's top 5 shakes out. I really want to look at your first 3 guys because although you do need 4 starters, and we saw that when the Diamondbacks and Phillies just kept doing bullpen games in the NLCS last year because neither of them trusted their number 4 starter, whereas the Rangers had basically 5 starters in the postseason that they trusted to send out there. You can use some in the bullpen. You can start different guys. It's great to have that. And the O's should have some good depth for the postseason. You could use Dean Kramer and Tyler Wells and Cole Irvin and John Means in these different spots. But in terms of 3 guys, you always got to have at least 3 guys that are like, they are going to start games and the biggest games in the postseason. The Orioles' top 3 right now: Corbin Burnes, Kyle Bradish, Grayson Rodriguez. How does that shake out against the top 3 of some of the other best teams? So I'm looking at the American League, and I got to tell you, if you're just looking at top 3 right now, I think the Orioles would maybe be second. I think I would put them second right now. I think the clear-cut favorite, number 1, is the Seattle Mariners. With a top 3 of Luis Castillo, George Kirby, and Logan Gilbert, I am giving them the number 1 spot. And then it's really tough here. I think I would call it maybe a push, with maybe a slight edge to the Orioles, maybe with some hometown bias between the O's and the Blue Jays for the number 2 spot. I'd call the top 3 for Toronto Gausman, Bassett, and Berrios. I think the Blue Jays in general, as I mentioned, their whole rotation is better than the O's, but if you're just looking at top 3 and peak performance of Burnes, Bradish, and Rodriguez versus those guys, you could give a slight edge to the Orioles. You could argue it. Gausman and Burnes, I think I'd take Burnes slightly. Bassett and Bradish, I'm taking Bradish. Berrios and Rodriguez, potential is Rodriguez. Right now, you're probably still taking Jose Berrios, but overall, slight tiny edge to the Orioles. I'd put him second. Toronto would be right there. Of course, the Astros would be right there. Framber Valdez, Justin Verlander, and Christian Javier. Now, those top 2, probably better than what the O's have, but Christian Javier took a gigantic step back last year, and yet he is still the number 3 starter for the Astros. I'm taking Grayson Rodriguez over him right now. The Yankees, I mean, yeah, as I mentioned, Garrett Cole's great. Nobody's better, but like Stroman and Rodon, are they going to be healthy at all? I'm taking the O's guys over them. Minnesota's got a great rotation. Pablo Lopez, great as a number 1, but then Joe Ryan at 2 and Bailey Ober at 3 for the Twins. I'm taking the O's over those 3. I mean, the top 2 is comparable, but Grayson way better than Bailey Ober. So I'm taking them. And then the Rays, I mean, if healthy, maybe it's Eflin, Savali, and Springs, or maybe Eflin, Rasmussen, and Springs, but just too many questions there. And again, they just don't have a number 1 guy like the Orioles do have now in Corbin Burnes. With Shane McClanahan getting the Tommy John surgery, he's going to be out all of this year for the Rays. Like, they don't have that ace in a postseason series that the Orioles do. So I'm ready to say it. And this is the best part about the Corbin Burnes trade. Yes, you only get him for 1 year, but if you can get in the postseason, and it all depends on, these other AL teams could add more to their rotation at the deadline, as the Orioles could. But right now, I think Seattle is the only postseason rotation, the top 3, that I would take over the O's. And yes, Seattle's made their offense better this offseason, but I mean, who knows if they're going to get into the playoffs? You never know. They could kind of fall apart. They did it last year. So you never know what this Seattle team could do. If the O's are in the postseason, they could have the best postseason rotation. All it would take is for the Mariners to miss the playoffs. It could happen. And the O's might have the best top 3 in the AL. When have we ever been able to say anything close to that? Nothing close to that. Last year, yeah, you were feeling okay, but the Rangers definitely had a better rotation going into that series. 2014, I mean, yeah, the O's won the ALDS, but you can't argue it. The Tigers had a much better rotation. And quite frankly, in the ALCS, the Royals had a better rotation. You go back to 2012, the Yankees had a better rotation sending out there than the Orioles did in the ALDS. We just haven't really ever been able to say the O's have a better postseason rotation, but Corbin Burnes can make it that way. And I will say, if you do look around to the National League, which the O's wouldn't have to worry about until the World Series, but there are a handful of teams that are definitely better than the O's. Philly with Zach Wheeler, Aaron Nola, Ranger Suarez, that's definitely better than what Baltimore has. Quite frankly, that might be the best top 3 in baseball. If it's not them, it's the Dodgers. Yoshinobu Yamamoto, Tyler Glasnow, Walker Buehler. That's a great top 3. That's better than the O's. And the Atlanta Braves as well. Spencer Strider, Max Fried, and either Chris Sale or Charlie Morton. That's better than the O's. And you could even argue the Arizona Diamondbacks with Zach Gallen, Merrill Kelly, and now Eduardo Rodriguez, who they signed this offseason. That's probably a better top 3 than the O's send out there. But those are all NL teams, and you only got to deal with one of them in the postseason to win a World Series. So This Burnes trade just makes me feel so much better about the postseason as well. And you add all this up with the O's getting the better regular season innings, the more depth, and better in the postseason. I'll just say it now. I think the Orioles have a top 10 starting rotation in Major League Baseball. I mean, when's the last time we were able to say that? The 1980s? The 1970s? This offense is still great, but this Orioles team with Corbin Burnes, the top of the rotation, is going to look a little different. It's going to be a little jarring to have Burnes and then be followed by Bradish breaking out and Rodriguez breaking out, and then have solid innings from Means and Kramer and Wells and Irvin at the back end of your rotation. This is how a World Series rotation looks. And the O's could still add to it if they need to at the deadline. It's just, I keep getting to it. How much of a just season franchise changing move Corbin Burnes can be and will be for 2024. So if you're looking at this O's team, I'm saying number 2 rotation in the East, number 2 postseason rotation in the American League, and still one of the best young lineups in baseball. I'm going to say it again. I said it in the Corbin Burnes episode. I'll say it again. The Orioles are the team to beat in the American League in 2024. Let's welcome the expectations. Let's go win a World Series this year. Corbin Burnes could be a huge, huge part of that. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Make sure to leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen to the pod. Also, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles podcast on YouTube. We will be back tomorrow. Just want to let you know, we are back into quote-unquote in-season mode. Starting this week, we are back to 5 episodes a week, every day, Monday through Friday. Got a new episode here for you of the Locked On Orioles podcast. And tomorrow, we take a look at the other side of the Corbin Burnes trade. Not Corbin Burnes, but a little ode to Joey Ortiz and DL Hall and what they did for the O's organization, slightly at the major league level, and what they could be now as they move on to Milwaukee. And despite getting Corbin Burnes, how much we will miss Hall and Ortiz. But that's all coming up on tomorrow's episode. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.